uploading, so we're about to be streaming live on YouTube. Okay, it is uploading, so we're about to be streaming live on YouTube. Let me just fix this volume real quick.
Do we think people can click now?
Yes, people should be able to click. I just had to mute myself so we don't hear the repeat the whole time. So we are now streaming live. So everyone should be able to get on right about now. And we are running like 20 seconds behind as usual. So that should be good. And then Tom, feel free to peace out. Yeah, no problem. I think we
See ya. Have a great meeting, everyone.
Yep. Thank you for being here. All right. So I'll wait for some people to join on and then we'll go ahead and start. I'll give some introductions and then we'll start with the showing and then we'll introduce each panel individually. And we have Cassie and Barb to do that for us. So
I'm asking our two members to try now.
yeah, see if they're able to get on.
Hopefully there's more than just those two people. She says success. Let it rip.
Okay, that means my screen's probably lagging a little bit because I'm trying to keep track of if it's working, but maybe we just won't be able to see who's watching.
Okay.
All right, well, in that case, we'll just get started now anyway, since I don't think I'm going to be able to see that. And then, yeah, we shouldn't have a problem then. So thank you everyone for being here today for Persistence, Stories of the Vote. So today we really want to go over, you know, how we got here, taking a look at the women's movement, earning the right to vote, and the progress we've made, and kind of have some lighthearted discussion for once about where we are and what we can do about it, and take a break from the kind of divisive political climate that we exist in, take a break from, you know, this presidential election, and look at the larger political movement in this country, specifically dealing with suffrage and how people have fought for it over time. And I want to invite everyone to bring in their personal experiences as we go and make this about storytelling and reflection as we view these clips. So the first clip that I have for you all today is Race versus Sex, the beginning of the struggle. So I'm gonna let Cassie introduce the clip and talk about the vote as provided by PBS generously. And then we can go ahead and dive in. And like I said, we'll get to introductions afterwards when we go through the panels.
Thanks, Ethan. My name is Cassie Peg Kirby, she, her, hers, and I'm the director of the Women's Center. And as Ethan indicated, these are a couple of clips from a larger film that was offered through PBS and American Express called The Vote, that talked a lot about the suffrage movement, the challenges, the successes, and just as a good way to frame the importance of voting and how hard fought that right is. So the 15-minute clip we'll be watching first, Race versus Sex, Beginning of the Struggle, followed by reflections from our panelists. In this clip, we will examine some of the movement's early leaders and the tension between the women's suffrage and civil rights movements. Early leaders include Susan B. Anthony, Frederick Douglass, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, many of whom began as abolitionists working towards a shared cause. When Black men gained the right to vote in 1870, however, the suffrage movement is bitterly divided. With the start of the 20th century, a cause initially advocating for equal rights for all had split along the well-worn fault lines of race and sex.
With that, I'll go ahead and start sharing my screen. and we will view the first clip. It's about 20 minutes long. All right, let me know if you can see and hear that.
Yes, I can. The sound is gone.
There's still no sound, Ethan.
Let me see if I can change the settings real quick.
It started with sound and then stopped. So do you have to stay unmuted?
It's possible I do. See if it plays now.
So remember, man, if you come to work tomorrow and your secretary refuses to do the filing and then go home and find that your wife has refused to do the cooking, don't blame them. Remember, you gave them the vote 50 years ago.
It had been the opening act in what proved to be an epic struggle for equality, a crusade carried out by millions of women over the better part of a century to secure for themselves the right to vote and thereby America's democracy.
To be disenfranchised is to be told that you do not matter, because the right to vote is about the power that governs your possibilities.
The right to vote is the heart of democracy. And if half the country doesn't have the right to vote, you're nowhere near being a democracy.
Women would go out canvassing and the men would be terrible to them. So you're trying to wear the pants of the family. And this is male territory. And how dare these women begin to come in and make a difference?
This struggle is going on at the same time that the nation is resolving the Civil War. So to introduce women is to disrupt a political culture that is built on exclusion, that is built on the notion that politics is a white man's business. It's a civil rights battle. We don't think of it like that, but it truly is a great civil rights battle. Suffragists have to change the idea of what women's role in society will be. What is her claim on citizenship? The textbooks when I went to school said women were given the vote. We weren't given anything.
Major funding for American Experience is provided by At Liberty Mutual, we believe progress happens when people feel secure. That's why we exist, to help people embrace today and pursue tomorrow. Liberty Mutual Insurance is a proud sponsor of American Experience. When it comes to wireless, Consumer Cellular gives its customers the choice. Our no-contract plans give you as much or as little talk, text, and data as you want. And our US-based customer service team is on hand to help. To learn more, go to consumercellular.tv. The power of inquiry, the joy of discovery. The Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, driven by the promise of great ideas. Major funding for The Vote is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by the National Endowment for the Humanities, bringing you the stories that define us. Additional funding for The Vote is provided by the Arthur Vining Davis Foundation, investing in our common future, and the Barbara Lee Family Foundation Fund. American Experience is also made possible by the Robert David Lyon Gardner Foundation, members of the Documentary Investment Group, and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you. More than 6 decades had passed since the clamor for women's suffrage first was raised, most loudly at a convention in Seneca Falls, New York, in 1848. Some 300 people had come that July to discuss the rights of women and had listened as 32-year-old abolitionist Elizabeth Cady Stanton decried the lack of them, provocatively comparing her condition as a free married woman with children to slavery. We assembled to protest against a form of government existing without the consent of the governed, Stanton proclaimed, to declare our right to be free as man is free.
At the time of Seneca Falls, a woman had no legal existence. When married, she was absorbed into the person of her husband. Now, that would be fine if there were women who weren't married. But adult women were overwhelmingly married women, and they had no legal standing.
Married women could not sign a contract. If they worked outside the home, they couldn't keep their paycheck. It went to their husbands. If they dared to divorce, husbands retained custody of the children. The doors of public universities were closed to them. There were just many, many ways in which they were second-class citizens.
The Declaration of Sentiments, adopted by the convention, had been modeled on the Declaration of Independence and included a list of resolutions outlining the rights to which women, as citizens, should be entitled.
Seneca Falls is the first very public demonstration and announcement that women are asking for a whole series of rights that they feel they've been denied. And it is considered really radical. They're fighting for education. They're fighting for the right to own property. They want to be full adult American citizens.
Of the 11 resolutions put forward by Stanton, only one was considered so controversial that it failed to pass unanimously. Resolution 9, which demanded for women the right to vote, a right that had engendered equal controversy among the men who wrote the U.S. Constitution.
One of the remarkable things about the history of democracy in the United States is that the Constitution in its original form said nothing about the right to vote. When the founding fathers talked about we the people, they were talking about adult white males and really adult white respectable males. They had different views about how broad the franchise should be. So instead of hammering out a consensus view, they punted rights to the states. In most states, the notion was that in order to have the franchise, you had to be independent in some economic and social sense. And women had very few opportunities to be independent.
Opposed by Stanton's husband and by her father, who threatened to disown her, woman suffrage found its first male champion in Frederick Douglass, who had escaped enslavement to become a leader of the abolitionist movement. From the abolitionist ranks also came the first generation of suffragists, Lucretia Mott, Lucy Stone, and Sojourner Truth, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, Sarah Remond, Susan B. Anthony, women for whom the two causes at first were entwined. When the conflict over slavery finally exploded into civil war, the suffragists set their own agenda aside to help secure rights for those who'd been enslaved, expecting, as Stanton put it, that when the constitutional door is open, we will avail ourselves of the strong arm and the blue uniform of the black soldier to walk in by his side. Their rallying cry now was equal voting rights to all. Instead, under pressure from congressional Republicans, the party of Lincoln, Stanton and her friends were asked in 1869 to support the 15th Amendment, which extended federal protection for the franchise only to African American men.
The suffragists truly believe, perhaps naively, that once the war is over, all eligible citizens are going to get the vote. They are shattered when they're told that the nation cannot handle two great reforms at once. They can't swallow Black men getting the vote and women getting the vote at the same time. Frederick Douglass says, I believe in women's suffrage. I always will, but the Black man needs it first. My people are being killed.
The question of compromise, once introduced, quickly became a wedge. If you will not give the whole loaf of justice to the entire people, Susan B. Anthony told Douglas, it should be given to the most intelligent and capable portion of women first. Elizabeth Cady Stanton was less civil. Think of Sambo, she fumed, who never read the Declaration of Independence or Webster's spelling book, making laws for educated, refined women.
Stanton and Anthony have constructed the debate around the vote as one that positions white women against African American men. Stanton in particular has made the argument that she will not see former slaves, the sons of slaves, enfranchised over elite educated women. These are ideas that are not uncommon, but now racism is sort of in a full-throated way part of the deliberations.
In the end, the fragile coalition forged by the Civil War was shattered by the terms of the peace, and causes once regarded as compatible have been set in opposition, to be prioritized one over the other if expedient. As Frances Ellen Watkins Harper noted ruefully, when it was a question of race, I let the lesser question of sex go. But the white women all go for sex, letting race occupy a minor position.
People will go in one direction or another out of this debate. Men and women, black and white. There are those who say we should remain committed to our ideals. And there's others who say this is politics and we need to compromise. And that has consequences far beyond any encounter in the vestibule of a meeting hall. This is mapping, right? Political culture for the nation, for women, but for the nation.
By the time African American men began to cast ballots and hold office in the South in the early 1870s, the first generation of suffragists had split over strategy. Some sought to secure women the vote by petitioning for changes to state constitutions, believing voter eligibility a matter more properly determined by the states. The rest joined Stanton and Anthony in their quest for a federal remedy and tried to push through what they hoped would be the 16th Amendment, barring the infringement of voting rights on the basis of sex. But aside from a school board election here and a municipal election there, the ballot remained elusive.
Most people thought that
women's demand for the vote was something of a joke. Back in the 19th century, it was seemed so far-fetched.
Women were considered too emotional, not intelligent enough. They were supposed to be in the domestic sphere. So the first job of the suffragists was really to completely change attitudes of millions of Americans and convince very reluctant men that this is an important idea. Because only men could decide whether women deserved the vote.
Even after the two factions joined forces in 1890, under the umbrella of the National American Woman Suffrage Association, the only place the cause gained any real traction was in the newer states of the West, where population was sparse and women's votes were regarded as an asset. The first state in what came to be known as the suffrage column was Wyoming, which joined the Union in 1890 with its women already fully enfranchised. It was followed over the next 6 years by 3 more Western states. Then the forward march stalled.
By the late 19th century, in white, middle class, and upper class American society, there was a shrinking faith in democracy. In the North, a lot of people are saying, well, democracy is not an unalloyed blessing. We have all of these immigrants coming in. They don't speak English. They're not very smart. I don't think we should let them vote. In the South, of course, politicians were busy disenfranchising African Americans who had been enfranchised during Reconstruction.
15th Amendment didn't say people have the right to vote regardless of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. It said states can't deny people the right to vote. And Southern states realized, well, they wouldn't deny the right to vote by race. They deny it if your grandfather was a slave. That's not specified in the 15th Amendment.
So the dominant movement is to take voting rights away from people. And that is something which the women's suffrage movement runs up against at the end of the century.
As states across the South moved to bar Black men from voting, by means of grandfather clauses, literacy tests, poll taxes, and brute force, the National Association, with Susan B. Anthony's assent, adapted to the prevailing mood. African American women who had been prominent in the movement were sidelined, and Southern chapters permitted to refuse Black members. In 1894, Anthony even went so far as to ask Frederick Douglass to keep away from a suffrage convention in Atlanta for fear of alienating potential supporters.
Frederick Douglass is the one who stands up and says to women who are ambivalent about calling for the vote, well, you must work for suffrage. So to say to him that he's not welcome in the South in Atlanta is a terrible thing. And Anthony probably actually believed that, as she said, when we get the vote, when white women get the vote, we'll make everything okay for everybody. But it certainly encouraged the continuing segregation and discrimination.
African American women are going to continue to work toward women's rights. They're interested in the vote, but they are also using those ideas to transform and control their institutions in churches, in fraternal orders, in benevolent societies. They're going to build, by the 1890s, an African American women's club movement. And within that, they are also going to be claiming women's rights in their own terms. These are sisters who are divided because of racism and because of white supremacy, and they're asking each other to concede on the issue of rights. And it will impact every single attempt to bring women broadly together in action for a better society.
By the close of the 19th century, the National Association was comprised mainly of white middle-class women, but was no more effective for being so.
All right, so that was the first clip. So that provides our topic for this first panel. And I'll have Cassie go ahead and, lead us in that discussion.
Thanks, Ethan. So we'll now use the next 15 minutes for reflection, conversation, and storytelling about this clip. Our panelists for this first clip include Gabrielle Blake, who is a junior paralegal studies major with minors in history and political science from Warren, Ohio. She's been a part of Academic Stars and the Provost Leadership Academy, and is currently the Black United Students Director of Political Affairs and Grievances, as well as a resident assistant in Dunbar Hall. We also have Professor Denise Harrison, who's a lecturer in Pan-African Studies at Kent State University. Her expertise includes intersectionality, crossroads of race, class, and gender, first wave feminist and suffragist Black women writers, food sourcing, food and sustainability, food activism, history of cooking, Africans and African Americans, Native American traditions, Native American culture, and environmental issues. We also have Professor Ashley Nichols, who is an assistant professor of political science at Kent State. Her research centers on issues of power, social equity, and democratic participation, working at the intersections of urban politics, nonprofit and voluntary studies, and public policy and administration. Her area of specialization is community development, broadly defined. Dr. Nichols holds a PhD in public affairs with a specialization in community development from Rutgers University in Camden. So with that, is there anyone who would like to begin to share your thoughts on the clip that we just watched? Any initial thoughts?
Do we raise our hands or just start talking?
Just jump in. I was getting ready to call on you, Denise, because of all of your experience with Seneca Falls and research and being part of conferences and your beautiful quilt behind you.
Yeah, one of the things that I've done in the past is take a tour to Seneca Falls, interested in how in the Seneca Falls area that race, class, gender, Blacks as well as Indigenous, Aboriginal, First Nations people all come together in that area. In particular, those first wave feminists are interested in abolition, and that really gets them out of the private sphere into the public sphere. Once they are in the public sphere, they really understand what it means to be entailed. They can associate that entailment with their sisters who are in bondage. It's not the same, but they have this feeling that they are locked in a different kind of bondage. And then at the same time, the Hicksite Quaker women are active leaders in their society, and they are interested, and probably what we don't often say is that the Haudenosaunee women of the Onondaga Nation, the Seneca Nation, the Six Nations, have a matrilineal society where they freely move about their culture and their society. And those first wave feminists who get to know them, in particular, Jocelyn, Gage, Matilda Jocelyn Gage, builds a relationship with them. And while at the same time she's calling them savages, she understands that they have a freedom that Black women don't have, Black women who are seeking freedom don't have, and that white women don't have. And so part of that introduction to affirming their own humanity comes from Indigenous women. And I think that's one of the things that we really need to talk about and start with and acknowledge that there were matrilineal society where women had power, and those first wave feminists saw that power and wanted to have that kind of power, especially after they were involved in the abolitionist movement.
I really appreciate that perspective and bringing that additional element into that, particularly since it isn't showing up in that clip, but it's something that you're very familiar with and have the background on too. So thanks for sharing that, Denise. Gabrielle or Ashley, any thoughts or reflections?
I'm sorry, I guess I'll just go. So when I was watching these videos and like learning about it in the past, I always have conversations with my great grandmother about where she was at in the civil rights movement. When JFK came to Warren, Ohio, where were you? Stuff like that. And so something that she mentioned to me, we just talked about this a couple of days ago, actually. And she said she remembered her mother worked at the polls when she was young. And I was like, well, how would that work? And she was like, as for us, like at least in Trumbull County in Warren, Ohio, she said they never really had a problem with voting rights. So I think it's really interesting to see where different parts of the country are on like the scale of equality concerning voting rights at that time. And she always just told me, she was like, yeah, she worked at the voting poll, she got paid good, no one mistreated her. And I just always found that interesting, because when you look at that timeline of 1940s and where most people were at, or what we're taught about most at that time, I was just really surprised to find out that like my great grandmother was working at the polls when other people couldn't even get inside the polls.
Mm-hmm. Thanks for sharing that. And I appreciate that perspective of the personal too, that this isn't, we're watching this, but it's also our families and our own history that's impacted by these stories and things that we're learning as well. Ashley, anything additional to share?
I think, so there are two things that kind of stood out for me that I kind of just want to bring up. And one is that as a person who works in political science, so much of our conversation is around voting. And the film is called The Vote. And I'm one of those people who's just like, the vote isn't everything. So I say that because it's so fundamentally important, but if we collapse democracy and political engagement down to one single act, it tends to push people away. And one of the things that I love about this is that it actually frames the vote and suffrage around political activism in completely different ways, around organizing for the vote, around the tensions and strategies and tactics that people are using to gain the right to vote, and in many ways, super divisive tactics. And so I think that, to me, one of the things I like about the clip is it kind of highlights that the vote is one thing, but it's informed by political mobilization, and we continue to mobilize around it, but it is not the only thing that makes us a democracy, in my perspective. And the other thing that really resonated with me when we were watching that again, so I watched it previously and watching it again right now, was the quote that there was a shrinking faith in democracy. And I do feel like that is in part related to that comment around the vote, and very much a part of what I'm hearing from organizers and activists on the ground are concerns around that shrinking faith in democracy. Like, what does it matter? Why would I show up to vote? Why would I show up to the polls? And I think, to me, to kind of historicize that, and to know that those feelings that people are experiencing right now are not new, that people persisted then and we can continue to persist now, are pretty powerful to me in the work that I do and the people that I talk with.
And it's interesting you talking about sort of the parallels with experiences now. Is there anything else that Gabrielle or Denise, or Professor Harrison, that you think of related to today. Some of the, you mentioned the, our perception of democracy, and also I'm thinking about the divisiveness. I mean, those are some things that we're seeing now too, that is still impacting our involvement in democracy and our experiences. Anything you'd want to share?
Well, I think one of the things that for people of color, and I'm not going to speak for all of them, I'm just going to say from where I'm positioned and my friends, relatives, and neighbors, that the vote is a really, really big deal. Because if we think about the framing of the Constitution of having representation, if you don't vote, it's kind of understood in this society that you don't have a right to critique. You don't have a right to criticize if you don't exercise that right to vote. And that the fight was so hard won for us. And still, when you understand that in Alabama in 2018, how many people were disenfranchised, not just Black people, Republicans, as well as Democrats, independents, that anytime we have a system whereby your state actually have to send you instructions to say, place your absentee ballot in this envelope, then put that envelope in this other envelope, and your ballot would be counted. People didn't know that. And that's today. Or my daughter-in-law, who's living in Australia, gets her ballot from the embassy, and then the embassy sends them an email and tells them it has the wrong zip code on it. That's not something she did. That is from the Board of Elections in Akron through the state of Ohio that put the wrong zip code on it. Fortunately, the embassy will mail her ballot in. If they left it up to them to mail it in, because it has the wrong zip code in this climate, that ballot could be denied. So I think in some ways, while it has become critical that you understand how voting and not being able to vote disenfranchise you. And it's not your intent not be enfranchised, but there are so many pieces of in terms of state and federal government that says we can't win legally. If everybody in this country actually had access to the ballot and voted, maybe the people who are the leaders would not be the leaders. So we're going to make sure that they don't get to say who their leadership is. We're going to define leadership for them. And I think this election has driven that home in ways that I've not seen in my lifetime. And I've been voting ever since, I think when I was starting, it was 21, not 18. But I voted in every election since I've been able to vote. And I have never seen anything like this. And just Brucey having a parent that lived to be 96 years old that was constantly telling us last year, I've never seen anything like this. She's voted in every election and she had never seen anything like this. It's just, so for me, working towards helping to make sure people have access to the ballot has this year in ways that in the past I haven't done, it really is magnified now. And I've been a poll worker too, but this is crucial and critical, I think.
Yeah, just to add along with that, I'm political science and everything else. So I do like watching the videos and things of that nature. I just watched a video, and per one white male's vote, African Americans are represented 75% of that vote. And Latinx people are represented 50%. Just because Puerto Rico and Washington, D.C. have high density underrepresented communities, we need to take that into account. Definitely for other underrepresented groups that live in places that you can vote, it's very important to vote. And something that I keep trying to push for, at least through Black United Students, is that the local elections matter so much. They affect us way more than anything else is going to affect us. And no one pays attention to the issues, or they just vote Democratic or Republican without seeing their stances on issues. And in my hometown of Howland, people didn't vote for a certain issue, and now people are having flooding problems problems because someone is building on a wetland. If they would have educated themselves on that issue, we wouldn't have had this problem. So just like putting those two things out there are very important to me, and definitely like seeing people don't have faith in the Democratic candidate or the Republican candidate for the presidential election. But if you're looking at the senators that are up for running and the representatives, then you can have more faith in them because they're going to be passing the bills and even going against the president on certain things. So just educating yourself on the matter, educating yourself on the issues and the bills that are going through, because those are so important.
I think, yes, you're right. Up and down ballot voting, but also prosecutors. We talk about having a society that has this law and order policy, and oftentimes we don't even look at who's running as a prosecutor, and they have political affiliations as well. Judges have political affiliations. And so those things, excuse me, become really important when we're facing the criminal justice system more than other people. And I think Breonna Taylor's situation is a perfect example of us not knowing who our local prosecutors are and that the power that they hold. I have a nephew that went before the justice system for drug abuse, and a white person went to the same place for drug abuse in terms of the prosecutor in Portage County, identical crimes, identical. He got 8 years in prison. His white counterpart got 18 months. And you know what the lawyer told us? There is nothing you can do about that. Nothing.
Mhm.
So that's where I think our anger and our rage is stemming from right now, because people are seeing in a real way how these things affect us long term. The fact that people aren't talking about census. You know, this administration wanted to end census in July and August. And, you know, thank goodness we still have another month to go, that we need to get our sisters and brothers out there counted, all citizens really, because of the power that people have to control who represents you rather than you having the control to be represented by someone of your choosing versus someone choosing for you. So I think both go hand in hand right now.
Thank you so much for all of you sharing. Any last thoughts? You said a lot in terms of how we can use what we've watched today and sort of empower us in the world we're living in right now to continue to persist and work for positive change. Any last thoughts before we turn it back to Ethan?
I have one last thing. I think if we learn anything from our foremothers, is that we ought to learn about creating real alliances with one another rather than being adversaries. We need all of us, and we need to build relationships so that we can be advocates, not just allies, but we need to form the kind of allegiance with one another that when I'm not in the room, somebody remembers me and says, Denise would think this. I got to think about what would she say if she's at the table. And the second part is to make sure if I'm not at the table, the next time I am at the table or someone like me is at the table. And I think the major lesson we have to understand is we don't want to go back down that road of division among women, but we need to build coalitions, work together.
Fantastic. Thank you. Ashley or Gabrielle?
You're welcome.
Anything?
I would just add that I do support, I do want people to vote. I just want people to follow up that vote with that next step, right? Once people are in office, that they're holding their elected officials accountable and right, recognizing that that is part of it. And I think one of the things I like about this next clip too, is that there is an element to once someone is elected, strategies for kind of rabble rousing and causing trouble for them once they're there as targets. And so I just wanted to make sure that my little plug earlier was kind of couched in I think the vote is very important. I just want to see it as one mechanism for shifting change and holding people accountable in terms of decision making.
Yeah, and like just one thing to add on, a couple things. No, a lot of people have been showing up to Black United Students protests and Black Lives Matter protests over the last couple of months. As I have said at every single one of the protests, protesting is the first and beginning point. If you guys are not showing up to the pools, you're not showing up to the town halls, the community meetings, the council member meetings, then you're not doing what you're supposed to do afterwards. There's always a follow-up. Yeah, so just make sure that you guys are educating yourselves on the issues before you go into the polls and not just looking at a political affiliation and thinking that they're going to work for you. Look at who's paying them. Look at who's paying them. Look at those companies' marketing strategies and everything in between before you really go in there and make a biased decision that ends up messing everyone up. So yeah.
Thank you. Well, you've all given us a lot to think about. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it back to Ethan and Barb to take a look at the next clip.
Yeah, thank you so much for participating in that discussion. That was some excellent storytelling and some great perspectives and advice for a lot of people. Now I'll turn it over to Barb to introduce the next clip, and then I'll get us going.
Sure, I'm Barb Hipsman. Barb Hipsman Springer. I am a retired faculty member from the School of Journalism and Mass Communications. And I was also a political reporter for much of my adult life. In this next clip, it's kind of curious. For the League of Women Voters, I've been researching over the months the women's suffrage movement for some presentations we made. Much of the history of this happened in Ohio because the National Women's Suffrage Association actually was based in Ohio. Think of Ohio as a frontier. Think of Salem, Tiara, as one of the places where a lot of this happened. And it's interesting to me how much of Ohio there really is in this story. In this particular clip, there's, it kind of starts in 1917, which is 6 decades since the start, since Susan B. Anthony and 1948 in the Seneca Falls. They're frustrated by a lack of success. Everything you heard before, just frustrating some of them. There's got to be a better way. And so Alice Paul, who's a suffrage leader, organizes a daily picket in front of the White House between a certain date and then when Woodrow Wilson was to get inaugurated, his ceremonies. And it was to bring media attention to her idea that Wilson was not taking action, that it just wasn't happening, and his unwillingness was really a bedrock of a problem. And beginning, it also was around the time of the First World War. So now we went from the Civil War, now we're in World War I. Hello, when's it going to change? But this changed the landscape of protest. And I think as a transition into our next panel, there's really a difference and a change in the landscape of protests, as we can see from day to day recently. Back then, factions in the movement were trying to identify ways to leverage World War I for the advancement of suffrage. And some of them disagreed with Paul's very bold approach. And they don't get into it too much in this section, but there were women who were arrested and had to be force fed when they went on hunger strikes. And eventually it did lead to the suffrage movement getting successful. So we'd start this section, which is called Upping the Ante. Ethan?
One second.
Years ago today, the 19th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution gave women the right to vote. This anniversary, a militant minority of women's liberationists was on the streets. So remember, man, if you come to work tomorrow and your secretary refuses to do the filing and then go home and find that your wife has refused to do the cooking, don't blame them. Remember, you gave them the vote 50 years ago.
It had been the opening act in what proved to be an epic struggle for equality, a crusade carried out by millions of women over the better part of a century to secure for themselves the right to vote and thereby participate in America's democracy.
To be disenfranchised is to be told that you do not matter, because the right to vote is about the power that governs your possibilities.
The right to vote is the heart of democracy. And if half the country doesn't have the right to vote, you're nowhere near being a democracy.
Women would go out canvassing and the men would be terrible to them. So you're trying to wear the pants of the family, and this is male territory. And how dare these women begin to come in and make a difference?
This struggle is going on at the same time that the nation is resolving the Civil War. So to introduce women is to disrupt a political culture that is built on exclusion, that is built on the notion that politics is a white man's business. It's a civil rights battle.
We don't think of it like that, but it truly is a great civil rights battle. Suffragists have to change the idea of what women's role in society will be. What is her claim on citizenship?
The textbooks when I went to school said women were given the vote. We weren't given anything. We took it.
Major funding for American Experience is provided by. At Liberty Mutual, we believe progress happens when people feel secure. That's why we exist to help people embrace today and pursue tomorrow. Driven by the promise of great ideas. Major funding for The Vote is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and by the National Endowment for the Humanities, bringing you the stories that define us. Additional funding for The Vote is provided by the Arthur Vining Davis Foundations, investing in our common future, and the Barbara Lee Family Foundation Fund. American Experience is also made possible by the Robert David Lyon Gardner Foundation, members of the Documentary Investment Group, and by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you. The nation's capital had barely begun to rouse itself on the morning of January 10th, 1917. When Alice Paul turned her back on decades of polite patience and politics as usual, and threw down the gauntlet at the very gates of the White House. A dozen suffragists assembled there just before 10 o'clock, shouldering the colors of the National Woman's Party and banners addressed to the president. They stood in silence until midday, when they were relieved by another group, who stayed until 5:30. Squads will be stationed about the White House daily until the presidential inaugural on March 4th, the Washington Herald reported. This is generally regarded as the most militant move ever made by the suffragists of this country.
No one had ever picketed outside the White House like this before. For women to stand at the gates of the White House and demand attention from the president, to demand rights, is stepping far outside of social norms for that time.
There had been picket lines in the labor movement for years. It's not a tactic that they invented, but applying it to suffrage and using the White House and specifically its occupant, Woodrow Wilson, as the target was something entirely new. It was a brilliant way of upping the ante.
The demonstration had been hatched in tandem with Harriet Stanton Blatch, who'd led a deputation of 300 women to the president just days before to secure his pledge for the federal amendment as a memorial to Inez Milholland. Wilson had refused, Until the orders of my party are changed, the president had told them, it is impossible for me to do anything other than I am doing. For Blatch, the only rational response was radical action. We have got to take a new departure. We have got to bring to the president individually, day by day, week in and week out, the idea that great numbers of women want to be free, will be free, and want to know what he is going to do about it.
It's now 1917. They have not made any real progress toward a federal amendment. They can't point to any real success. Something new is needed.
The whole idea was to put pressure on the decision makers and to get under the skin of Wilson. You are not going to ignore this movement.
At first, the protest seemed a source of amusement to Wilson, who tipped his hat to the women as he passed through the White House gates. On the second day, when the temperature hovered at 35 degrees and the pickets were reduced to perching on hot bricks and taking turns with a donated muskrat coat, he sent a messenger to ask them in for coffee, a kindness they refused. By the fourth day, everyone involved had come to regard the demonstration as a trial to be endured. We are all worn out by the picketing, Alice Paul confessed to a friend, and how we shall keep it up until March 4th is a problem we cannot face with equanimity.
Alice Paul and her staff do an incredible amount of outreach. They are reaching out to nearby states, to colleges, to small suffrage groups, anybody they can think of who would be interested in coming to demonstrate at the White House for the suffrage amendment.
So desperate was Paul for fresh recruits that she even issued invitations to local African American activists, setting aside her deep conviction that their presence risked turning a woman's protest into a racial one. 53-year-old Mary Church Terrell, a charter member of the NAACP and a longtime suffragist, answered the call more than once, though she'd long ago resigned herself to the fact that white suffragists typically found it more expedient to exclude her.
If you're a Black woman, white women's racism is not news. Racism is the order of the day. You know what that is. But that's not exactly a reason to stay home. African American women understood that the right to vote was yet another tool to try to dismantle the structures that were still in place even after the end of slavery, and to ensure African American safety and perhaps prosperity. So Mary Church Terrell was willing to join white women's protests to the extent that she believed it would ultimately deliver the vote for Black women.
For every show of solidarity, however, there was a defection. Paul was bombarded with letters protesting the picket, resignations, cancellations of the suffragist, even a plea from her mother to call off what she described as the undignified annoying of the president. Instead, the vigil continued, day in and day out, usually 6 days a week. By way of explanation, Paul offered an analogy. If a creditor stands before a man's house all day long demanding payment of his bill, the man must either remove the creditor or pay the bill.
Alice has never lost her focus on Woodrow Wilson. And all of these years, it's always been about Woodrow Wilson. And it's still about Woodrow Wilson, the man in the White House.
For nearly 3 years, while the countries of Europe have been consumed by battle and bloodshed, The rhythms of America's day-to-day had continued with little variation or interruption. It therefore came as something of a shock when in early February 1917, Wilson answered Germany's ongoing aggression at sea by severing diplomatic relations. As lobbyist Maud Wood Park remembered, the importance of the slogan, "He kept us out of war," in the re-election of President Wilson had led to the belief that the United States would never be involved in the conflict. Overnight, it seemed, the shadow of the Great War fell upon Washington.
Probability of war gave suffragists some difficult choices. Were they going to put the idea of gaining suffrage aside for the duration of the war, or were they going to persist in the suffrage struggle, or were they going to try to juggle both things?
For Carrie Chapman Catt, the choice was a bitter one. Like many suffragists, she was a lifelong pacifist and believed that women, once they voted, would put an end to war. Just 2 years earlier, she'd helped to found the Women's Peace Party and had been advocating ever since for disarmament and mediation in Europe. But if American women refused to back their country now, she reasoned, they could hardly expect the country to back them.
Carrie Chapman Catt is a pragmatic politician. If she has to make a choice, suffrage is going to be the priority for her, and she's willing to sacrifice principle in other areas to move forward that agenda.
On February 5th, as the nation grappled with the implications of war, Catt arrived in the Capitol to have dinner at the White House. Officially, she was the guest of the Secretary of the Navy, but the evening's host was President Wilson.
This dinner comes at a really important time for Wilson. He's facing the prospect of having to say to many of those who voted for him, I am no longer able to keep us out of war. For Catt, it's also a really important time. There are major states, New York being the most significant, that are having a referenda in the fall of 17, and she needs President Wilson's support. So we don't know for sure what happens at that dinner. There's no transcript of what they discuss, but what we do know is what happens afterwards.
Less than 3 weeks later, in a hand-delivered letter to President Wilson, the National Association offered its services to the government of the United States. Although it was made clear that work on behalf of suffrage would not be set aside, the commitment to Wilson was unequivocal. In the event they should be needed, and insofar as we are authorized, we pledge the loyal support of our more than 2 million members.
Carrie Catt takes the approach that if we can prove to Wilson that American women can be trusted, our citizens, our patriots, are willing to step up, are willing to support him, then maybe we can slowly turn him around. She also makes one of the great compromises of her life, and she's kicked out of the Women's Peace Party. She is snubbed by her fellow pacifists. And she does this because she feels this will help gain support to the federal amendment.
Alice Paul, for her part, expressed no support for the war. And the daily protest at the White House gates went on, to the mounting consternation of not only President Wilson and the men of Congress, but also Harriet Stanton Blatch, who believed that in a time of national crisis, picketing ought not to be pursued. Even Paul's mentor, the implacable British suffragette Emmeline Pankhurst, had set her demand for the vote aside when England went to war. But Paul refused to back down. When the Civil War began, Susan B. Anthony was told the same things we are being told today. If she'd only drop her suffrage work and become an abolitionist, women would be given the vote as a reward as soon as the war was over. She did drop her work, and as a result, all legislation in which women were interested was promptly dropped.
Alice said, I am not going to make that mistake again. We are going to continue the battle for the federal amendment. We are going to continue picketing. And they did.
The pickets remained at the White House gates all through February. They were still there on the eve of Wilson's second inaugural on March 3rd. A contingent of hundreds who marched the half mile around the White House 4 times in a drenching rain, chanting votes for women. And when President Wilson asked Congress for a declaration of war on April 2nd, the pickets took up their vigil once more. By then, the battle lines within the suffrage movement had been clearly drawn. Paul on one side, Kat on the other. And between them, a president who, by his own account, was willing to go to war to make the world safe for democracy.
Kat and Paul are very similar in many ways. Both have these incredibly persuasive personalities, and they are decisive and focused once they've made decisions. So it's interesting that 2 women, both totally devoted to the same ultimate goal, take such different and antagonistic paths to get there.
The joint session of Congress that President Wilson called in April 1917 was historic. Not simply for the declaration of war it was asked to consider, but because for the first time, a woman participated in the deliberations. 34-year-old Jeanette Rankin, a longtime suffragist, now the newly elected Republican representative from the free state of Montana. When Rankin arrived in the House chamber that morning as the first woman ever to hold federal office, she was greeted with cordial applause. After taking the oath of office, she reintroduced the woman's suffrage amendment and made history again, as the first of her sex to sponsor a bill in Congress. And in the hours before dawn on April 6th, Rankin held fast to her pacifist convictions and voted against sending American sons and husbands to the killing fields of Europe. Although 50 others voted with her, Rankin's dissent made no difference. And the nation woke that morning to the prospect of imminent war, a prospect many suffragists regarded as an opportunity. Over the months to come, as the draft plucked tens of thousands, then millions of young men out of the workforce, women would slip in to replace them. They took jobs in foundries, oil refineries, blast furnaces. They manufactured explosives and armaments, tools and airplane parts, uniforms for the armed forces. As Harriet Stanton Blatch put it, when men go a-warring, women go to work. War compels women to work. That is one of its merits.
Blatch said one of the dirty secrets of war is that it's good for women. She thought it would help women enter into industry, and it did.
It was a massive modern war, and there was a vast hinterland of people who needed to be involved to get those armies out there and to get them active. And so women could justify by their war effort the fact that they were patriots too.
In Washington, the Wilson administration moved to avail itself of the support Carrie Chapman Catt and others had pledged, and created the Women's Committee of the Council for National Defense, the first governmental entity entirely comprised of and focused on women. With Anna Howard Shaw, Catt's predecessor at the National Association, as chairwoman, and Catt one of the Committee of 10, the Council marshaled the resources of scores of women's organizations and put them in service to their nation's defense, coordinating the cultivation and distribution of food, providing assistance to the Red Cross, promoting patriotism among recent immigrants. Caps were knitted for soldiers, Liberty bonds sold, and more than $100,000 raised to maintain a hospital in France. 74 women of the National Suffrage Association, most of them physicians or nurses, volunteered to go abroad to staff it. Catt, meanwhile, saw to it that their good turns for democracy did not go unnoticed.
We run a very sophisticated public relations outfit out of New York, pumping out articles about women in war and all the wonderful things they're doing. Send these to newspapers around the country. This is the mass media of the time. There's not even radio at this point. This is how America is learning what women are doing for the war.
Catt talks of women's war service as being equivalent to military service. It's as if she's leading a military organization, an army of women. And that's the phrase that she uses. The army of women organized for suffrage are now organized in support of the nation during a time of war.
The argument going back to the revolutionary period was if you carry a musket, you should have the right to vote. It was there in the Revolution, it was there in the War of 1812, it was there in the Civil War. Women weren't carrying guns in World War I, but they're making the argument that they are critical to the war effort and thus the right to vote should be extended to them.
All right, so that concludes our second clip, and we can now move into the second panel. I will say that Tiara does have a meeting to be at 7:15, but that should give us ample time within that 20-minute period to discuss and go over some things and then finish up for the night. So just want to be mindful of that, but I'll let Barb take it from here.
Okay. I think that was an interesting grouping of headlines. I might say that Carrie Chapman Catt gave her first speech after assuming the power of the National Women's Suffrage Association in lovely Brady Lake, which is just outside of Kent. Some of the things that we unearthed about women's suffrage and history in this area. Many of the women who were referenced in this group too were also educated at Oberlin College. Oberlin was the only school that admitted African Americans, Asians, and more importantly, women of those cultures. And so many of those women were instantly part of the suffrage groups, and you see them intertwined. And so they became friends at Oberlin. And I think that set the stage. And I find it fun that we're talking about this tonight on the edge of the debate tonight. I'd like to introduce the group, and maybe we could talk a bit about where we are in activism. I mean, do we have Carrie Chapman Catts among us? Do we have Alice Pauls among us? I think we do. And maybe that's where what we can talk about is the difference in activism between, say, when Tiara's in school right now to Nikki and back to Iris, you know, the dark ages, Iris, when you and I were in school, which was right around 1970, I might add. I'm having a hard time with my computer sitting here. So let me introduce you first. Tiara Moore is a senior from Salem, Ohio. She is first generation college. I know her mom went to college and didn't complete, she said. But I found it interesting that she's an English political science major with also a hope to go into, well, she's in pre-law. And I could see a great future. She's the third African-American woman to head up the Undergraduate Student Senate. And we're so happy tonight that Nikki Marchman Boykin, who I believe was the second woman to head up, no? The first?
I do know the first, Andrea Wright, so.
Andrea Wright, exactly.
Wants to meet her, I can hook you up one day.
Yeah, I think that'd be great. And so Tiara is the head of the Undergraduate Student Senate, and last year was instrumental in rebranding the whole Kent State Votes. And boy, we had a great time with that. It was, pre-shutdown, but a lot of different things about it. We had great turnout at the year before the 2018 elections. We had amazing change in the turnout. And so I think it really is having an effect on campus. So we'll hear from you. Nikki Marchman Boykin has been around Kent for a long time. I do believe she showed up in my office when I was daily Kent Stater advisor and had some big demands, and we worked through that. But she is a native of Akron and is a Kent State grad with a master and a master teacher in the Kent City schools. Many of our children have had Nikki for government classes. She's a social studies educator, and her expertise is infusing technology, current events, and her love for all things that are politically and culturally empowering into her American government and Black experiences classes. She's a proud member of the League of Women Voters of Akron and a Life and Ruby member of the Sigma Gamma Rho sorority and a mother of Brianna, her daughter. Iris Meltzer, I've known just as long. She's state president this year of the State League of Women Voters of Ohio. I mean, big office. She's a longtime Kent resident. Iris worked for 28 years as the administrator of adolescent health services for Akron Children's Hospital. And previously, she was a founding member of the board of the Portage County's first domestic violence shelter for women and children. She's a community activist on many fronts, and she's often seen at local marches on issues and that sort of thing. She served as president of the Kent League for 4 years as well, so suffrage is her thing. You know, we heard about Alice Paul and Carrie Chapman Catt, very different kinds of personalities and different ways of approaching things. I was curious, Iris, at the national level or at the state level, how are women doing in leadership positions? How does it feel?
Feels pretty scary.
Yeah.
But it's certainly empowering to see the number of women taking leadership roles at the national level, at the state level, and certainly at the local level. And that's a relatively new thing, not just new since women got the vote or since Jeanette Rankin represented Montana. But I certainly, and I'm rather older than you, Barb, and grew up in an era where it was not typical to see women in elected office. They got as high as being school board or members of the school board. They were never superintendents. They might be principals. So there certainly have been a lot of changes. I suspect we have numerous Carrie Chapman Catts and a fair number of Alice Pauls on Kent's campus and in Ohio and at the national level as well.
Well, I know she's left, but I think Gabby is definitely an Alice Paul type. She takes no prisoners when she's out there on those marches.
Yep.
Nikki, when we crossed paths, there was all sorts of things, you know, branching out at Kent State. It seemed like the Black United students on campus were kind of finding their footing and becoming pretty activist. What are your memories of, and where do you think it's gone since then, since you're still in the Kent area?
Well, I think you're correct in that there were a lot of issues that we definitely needed to address, had to get our footing, and pretty quickly. I find that what students deal with today, I dealt with 30 years ago, but I also think that students today are a lot more savvy than I was. with the social media, just being a little bit more.
Oh, mhm. Big difference.
Yeah, and really having that voice and being able to amplify that voice through, just a click on the phone, in regards to who I think is maybe a Alice Paul in her own way today, I would say a Stacey Abrams. And
Oh,
her
sure. Mhm.
and the fact that she has been steadfast in the fact that although she lost that election, she is going to persist, and she is doing her fair fight work, and she is in your face, and I see a lot of, again, the young people and young women in particular who are leading at Kent State. Now that's one thing that was pretty similar between my time, women really stepping up. So those are my thoughts on the activism.
Tiara, where are we going? You've stepped up to the plate and taken a big baseball bat out and said, we're going to hit this.
Yeah, I mean, I think we're headed towards a home run. I mean, like, I always tell people that, my generation, like, are the younger people, we're the next leaders, like we are. And like, this is our time to step up and show that we want to see changes in this country, and like we're willing to fight for them, and we need to use our voices. And I think we can definitely see that. I know Nikki had mentioned social media, and I think that's like a huge way for the next, like the younger generation, to connect and be advocates for all these different issues. I like can connect to my peers all around the country on social media, and I think that's very powerful because I have colleagues, and I met in conferences in like Arkansas and like Boston and, California, like Massachusetts, and like they update me on what's happening in their areas, and I can update them what's happening in my areas. And like, it's just crazy to see like how connected we are as like a generation, and how like we can really work together to make our voices heard. So yeah, I definitely think we're headed on the up. I am one of the few Black student body presidents that's a woman at this university, as you mentioned. And I really wanted to have this role, like not only to help my community, my university. I love Kent State University, and this is, I wanted to leave it better than I found it, but I wanted to show other young Black girls that they could do this too, because I didn't see any women like me or, people who look like me all in this role at my time here. And it was really daunting at first to even dream that I could be in this role, because a lot of people told me I couldn't, they looked at me and they're like, like, you maybe can be the chief of staff, or you maybe can have this role. You can just be the senator for diversity, but like the president, And I wanted to show them like, no, like I can be the one in charge. Like I don't have to have a lesser role just because I'm a woman, just because I'm Black. Like I can be the biggest voice in the room and advocate for our student body. And so, yeah, that's
You're smiling because last spring you were so nervous and tense about it. And I'm just like, well, of course you're going to win. Yeah, you're going to have to work hard to get it, but you're going to win. And you remember that at a lecture, you were just like fretting. And it was just good to see because you were concerned, and that concern must have come across to your constituents as well, the various students.
Yeah, I think it's hard not to be concerned, especially like, I definitely, I think running my campaign, I learned why it's hard for women to get involved in these spaces sometimes, because, I'd go talk to a group of people and the response would be different than my, running mate, just because I'm a woman. Like people wouldn't think I knew what I was talking about. They would just ask for my number afterwards and just didn't take me seriously.
Like Woodrow Wilson didn't take them seriously.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think a lot of presidents have that problem. Not to mention any names right now, but we may see that come out tonight in the debates.
Yes.
If each of you had to look ahead 5 years, we have Kamala Harris, and we had quite a number of women step to the mat to try to become the president and really got in there and fought. What do they need to do to really make it?
I'm not sure it's so much what they need to do as what we need to do.
Mm-hmm.
And I think as probably the oldest person on this call, what I need to do is not just step back, but give a hand up, not in terms of lifting somebody to where I am, but putting my hands down. You can't see it, but so they can step on my hands and I can keep working out and lift as opposed to pull. And I think that's what we can do is make space and be as supportive as we know how. And what I keep thinking of, and I'm assuming your shirt is Ruth Bader Ginsburg, but I'm not positive.
It is.
It is. When she was asked how many women would be enough on the Supreme Court, she said 9.
9. Yeah, it was great. And so I feel the same way. It's a lot of leadership needs to turn over.
Yep.
Nikki or Tiara?
I listened to Professor Dr. Harrison speak about coalitions and building. I think there needs to be some serious discussion. I think Black women are on board. We're on board, but I think there needs to be serious discussion even amongst white women as far as how they support other women. I know that was a major issue when we took a look at what happened with Hillary Clinton. And her quest to become president. So, I mean, I think there's some soul searching as women that we have to do, but in certain enclaves, there has to be some real serious discussion.
Yeah, and I would just add that, like, as women, like, we can't give up, and I know it's discouraging, I've been discouraged, like, even seeking, my presidency on, only university level. But I think, we have to keep in mind that the idea of women having the vote was so foreign. It was such a taboo thing. And just like now, the idea of having a woman president is still similar to that idea to many people. Like they're still can't even imagine a woman president, but people back then couldn't imagine women voting. And now look where we're at. So I think we just have to keep pushing forward despite everything, because if people back then would have never thought that women could vote, and people today that they can never see a woman president, but I think we're going to have one. I really do.
Tiara Moore for president. Gabby Blake for president. Ashley Nichols for president. One of you gals who's underneath the age of 50 has got to do this.
When I look at Tiara and Gabby, I have to say openly, I am extremely proud of you two ladies, having been where you all are now and dealing with some of the issues that you're dealing with. It's not easy. Particularly when you're saying you're only the third person and it's 2020. So yes, please be encouraged and know that you have support in places that maybe you didn't know, but now you do. And make sure you take advantage of that support.
Yes, thank you.
Since it is a debate night, what question about women would you like to ask the candidates tonight? And that's how we'll end. Iris, the sage, the old lady on board. I'm going to pay for that.
Yeah, what would I want to ask the candidates about women? Probably something trying to get at the notion that women are people and women are amazingly fully human. Boy, I'm kind of stumped on that one.
And Nikki or Tiara?
I think I would definitely, I know Nikki's shaking her head, so I guess I'll take a shot at it. I would think I would ask about how they plan to support women's rights and, equality, because especially as I think the woman, her role in our society more and more gets put in her plate. She's meant to be the working woman. Now she's meant to be the mother. She's meant to be the friend, the spouse. There's so many roles that we have to play now in today's society that I would want to know how they aim to support that, especially women who want to go and have a career. I want to go and have a career, but I'm gonna need that support from my employer to like if I want to have a family and stuff like that. So I think as a society we need to like start looking at those things and make it easier for women to not only be leaders but to have a family and be a wife and a mother as well, because that right now is very hard. Employers, they don't understand if a woman wants to take off to have a kid, and like they make it very hard for her, but a man doesn't have to worry about those things. So I would want to know about
smiling because it's not progressed much. When the Equal Rights Amendment came to Illinois, it was 59 cents on the dollar, and that was 1982. And we're at what, 79? It's still that way. Woohoo! I'd like to ask the other participants too.
I do have one thing I want to add.
Okay, Nikki.
I'm most concerned about women's reproductive rights, in particular looking at Black women and the mortality rates of Black women when it comes to childbirth, no matter what economic status that they're in. That is extremely important. I am a cancer survivor, so looking at how we treat women throughout that process, because there's a difference in how women have cancer than men, right? So those are things that I find I would like to hear from our candidates about.
Denise, you came back on and people are popping on now. You have to unmute yourself, Denise. There you go.
You wanted to hear from some of us. Yeah, I would agree with Nikki on the full range of reproductive rights for women of color. I have a niece that passed away in childbirth and has a 4-year-old son. Very tragic. Her sister was a midwife and a paraprofessional nurse, and nothing that they did could save her. She was just literally forgotten when she went in to have her baby. And I think that's a critical thing for Black women. But if we look at the fullness of it, we have to look at issues around foster care, that Black women lose their children for the most minor problem that they may have based on economics, and the judicial system, and all of those things are entwined. So when we talk about reproductive rights, we have to look at the full issue of reproductive rights. And I think Black women and other women of color can really raise those questions. If we look at the women who were in detention, we thought 30 years ago you could get a forced sterilization. We don't think about that as something that would happen to women today. And clearly under this administration, it looks like women were forcefully sterilized against their will. So that conversation is really, really broad, and we have to keep it a broad conversation.
It's almost confusing. We have sterilization, we have the pandemic, we have rampant unemployment because of that. The issues that are so affecting each woman in this country are phenomenal right now. And I think the stress of it is the mental health of women across the country, leading those families. So Ashley or Cassie or Ethan?
I won't add anything. This has been I'm glad to share space with you all.
Same. Ethan?
Yeah, I'm here to say the same thing. Just being mindful of like Tiara's time, but so I want to provide an opportunity for any closing remarks. But before I do, I want to say to those on the live stream, like we're gonna finish up here, but I just want to say like thank you to all of you for attending. These perspectives have been eye-opening, I know, even just for me. And as Dr. Nichols said, it's just incredible to share this space and to hear these experiences and reflections, and keeping our eyes on the future. But yeah.
Well, I guess what I'm going to say is happy 100th birthday to the League of Women Voters, which is what grew out of the National Women's Suffrage Association. And turns out that 6 of us on this call are members of one league or another, which is pretty amazing. And hopefully the league will continue leading the way for young women and young men for the next 100 years.
Yeah, if there's nothing else, I'll go ahead and close down the live stream for tonight. But thank you all again. This has been just a wonderful event. And yeah, if there's any follow-up you'd like to share, feel free to send it to me or Tiara. But I'm happy to have hosted this with you all. And a special thanks to Cassie and Barb and Craig, who isn't able to be here, for helping me organize this. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Good night.
Good night.